Hi everyone, I'm Nate Edwards with BYU Photo, and today we are going over 10 tips for aspiring photographers. These are simple tools or bits of knowledge that will help you be more aware while you're taking pictures and really help you progress as a photographer. When I talk about exposure, I'm referring to the brightness or darkness of your image. A good exposure is typically not too bright that you lose the detail in your highlights, or too dark where you lose the detail in your shadows. Your exposure is made up of 3 elements: aperture or f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO. I'm not going to talk about the basics of how to get a good exposure here, but it's vital to understand how these work in relation to each other. I would strongly recommend that you get to a place where you're not relying on using the auto setting of your camera for proper exposure. The reason being, you have absolutely no control over the outcome. Have you ever taken a photo of a friend where they're lit from behind by a window or the sun and all you see is a silhouette of them and you don't know how to fix it? Understanding how to use your manual settings can help get a proper exposure and work through difficult situations that might be harder to navigate if you're using auto. So I personally use manual or shutter and aperture priority. That way I have control over my exposure and the exact outcome I am wanting. If I'm in a situation where my lighting is consistent and will not change, or if I'm using strobes in a studio or on location, odds are I'll be using manual mode. However, if I'm in a situation where I'm needing to capture split-second moments and my exposure is constantly changing, like at an outdoor event, I'm either shutter priority or aperture priority. I don't want to fight the exposure battle while trying to capture those moments. I like to let the technology work for me so I can focus on the moment. On shutter priority, you set the shutter speed and the camera automatically sets the aperture or f-stop for you. On aperture priority, you set the f-stop and the camera automatically sets your shutter speed for you. Then I use exposure compensation to help refine my exposure when it isn't giving me exactly what I'm wanting. I would caution that if you use these modes, to keep an eye on your settings. For example, if you're using aperture priority in a bright setting and you move to a dark room, your shutter speed may drop down to a very slow shutter speed and your image will have a lot of motion blur. I would strongly suggest you learn the principles of exposure so you aren't using these settings as a crutch, but more to help you focus on the creative process. Now, when you're getting ready to take a picture, you might first ask yourself, with reference to your camera settings, what is my priority? Is your aperture or shutter speed your priority? That leads us to tips 2 and 3. Aperture or f-stop is what determines your depth of field, meaning how much of your image is in focus. If you're taking a landscape photo, you typically want to use a large depth of field, meaning everything's in focus. So your f-stop could be anywhere between, let's say, f9 to f22. If you're taking a portrait, you might want to use a shallow depth of field, meaning the subject will be in focus, but the background will be out of focus or blurry. You can do that by using an aperture of, let's say, f4 to f1.2. The smaller the number, the shallower depth of field you will have. The larger the number, the more depth of field you will have. Using a shallow depth of field can also eliminate distractions that may be in the background and help when shooting in low light situations. Shutter speed determines how fast your shutter opens and closes, or on a mirrorless camera, how fast your sensor kind of turns on and off to record the information. If I'm wanting to freeze action like at a sporting event, I will want a fast shutter speed of around 1/1000th of a second at least. Or let's say I want to show the motion and movement of water or an athlete in action, I would use a slower shutter speed to show that movement. A good rule of thumb when deciding your shutter speed while hand-holding your camera is to not use a shutter speed slower than the focal length of your camera. For example, if you're shooting at a focal length of 200 millimeters, you do not want to use a shutter speed slower than 1/200th of a second, or you'll probably start to see motion blur from your movement. Or if you're using a 16 millimeter lens, you can get away with hand-holding your camera at around 1/20th of a second if you're holding really still. This is all based off of your subject not moving around fast as well. Remember, this is the minimum. If you are not confident with your ability to hold still, I suggest you use a faster shutter speed. Again, when you're setting your exposure, it is a good practice to ask yourself what your priority is, aperture or shutter speed. For example, if I'm taking a portrait, then aperture is probably my priority, and I will set that first, and then I will set my shutter speed, and then I will set my ISO after everything else is set. I personally want to keep my ISO as low as possible to preserve image quality. The higher the ISO, the more noisy or grainy your image will be. But don't let a high ISO scare you away from getting a proper exposure. There are times you may be shooting at 10,000 ISO or higher because the situation calls for it. I'm going to tell you about what I call the 5'10" rule. I'm 5 foot 10 inches tall. A lot of you guys are probably the same height as me. We're used to seeing things from this height. As a photographer, I want to give people a different perspective. Don't be afraid to kneel down or lay on the ground. My wife often laughs when we're out together somewhere and suddenly she can't find me, and then she sees me laying on the ground taking a picture with my phone or my camera. Here's a photo of me laying on the ground at a football game. Why am I on the ground? Because of this. This image would not look near as good if I shot it standing up. Notice how when the camera is low to the ground, it brings everyone above the horizon line. If I was standing up, the horizon line would cut right through the middle of my image. Getting the camera close to the ground lowers my horizon line and gives the subject more of a hero look. Also, don't be afraid to bring the camera up higher too, or even looking straight up or straight down. Give people a different angle or perspective than what they are used to seeing. If you are taking photos of kids, get down on their level. It will give the viewer a feeling of being down there with them. I feel like one of the biggest steps forward for me in my photography was understanding and being able to see light better. Learn to see where light is coming from, whether you're outside, in the sun or shade, inside your house or wherever. I feel like I am almost constantly looking at light, the direction, the intensity, the color, and so on, even when I'm not taking pictures. It helps me train my eyes to see. For example, one thing I like to do when photographing people with the sun outside is I almost always photograph facing the sun. That way my subject is lit from behind and I don't have squinty eyes or really harsh, ugly shadows. Typically, if you take a photo with your back to the sun and your subject looking into the sun, the light will look really flat. Your image will lack dimension and shape. Do not be afraid of shadows. Always remember that shadow equals shape. Shadows are what create shape on your subject, whether that's a person, a mountain, a flower, a building, anything. If you ever see me taking pictures at an outdoor sporting event, most of the time my positioning on the field will be because I like the light better from that angle. I like to chase the good light. It will make your images more dynamic. Pay attention to light. We'll go over some different elements of composition that are good to be aware of. Have you ever wondered what that grid pattern is when you're taking a photo with your cell phone? Those lines represent the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds teaches essentially that if you break down an image into thirds, both vertically and horizontally, and you put the subject into one of the places where the lines intersect, the image will be more balanced and it will feel more natural for the viewer in their interaction with the image. Most people, when they're starting to take photos, place the subject right in the center. More often than not, that is a very uninteresting and boring composition. That being said, after you learn and understand the rule of thirds, do not be afraid to break the rule. But if you do, make it an intentional decision knowing why you're breaking it. You can use lines that are man-made or naturally found around you to guide the viewer to your subject. Be sure to look to see if there's any leading lines as you're composing your image. One of your responsibilities as a photographer is to guide the viewer to look at what you want them to see. Leading lines is a good way to help with that. Pay attention to what is in your background. Sometimes we get so focused on the subject of our photo that we don't see what's behind them. I can't tell you how many times I've taken or I've seen other pictures of people with a pole or something coming out of the top of their head. it's not always the best look, so pay attention to what's in your background. There are times when it can really enhance your photo by introducing the element of depth with foreground, middle ground, and background. Notice the 3 layers of depth in this image. The BYU student checking the Samoan child's heart is out of focus in the foreground or closer to the camera. The Samoan child is in focus in the middle ground, followed by the other kids out of focus in the background. When you are out taking photos, look for ways you can add depth to your image. Part of depth can also be framing. You can frame your subject within the foreground and/or the background. It helps the eyes of the viewer to stay contained on your subject rather than wandering off. I was taught a while ago to ask myself, why am I taking this picture? What am I wanting others to see? And then make it my job to eliminate anything in my frame that is distracting others from seeing it. Isn't it frustrating when we see a beautiful sunset on the mountains, take a photo of it with our cell phone, and then look at it after and think, that doesn't look anything like what I really saw? I think a lot of times it's because of unseen distractions in our image. When we were looking at the mountains in person, we didn't see the tall parking lot lights in the way, or the power lines running across the frame of our image, or the ugly warehouse off to the side. We just saw the beauty of the mountains. So if that's what you're trying to capture, try to look around for different distractions in your composition that can be eliminated by either moving around or composing your image differently. If you're lucky enough to have multiple lenses to choose from, you may struggle knowing which one to use for different situations. Here's some things to consider. If you're wanting the viewer to feel like they are part of the experience, being close to the subject while using a wider angle lens will help facilitate that. If you want the viewer to feel more like a spectator or an observer, then being further away from the subject with a telephoto lens would be better for that situation. Now obviously, if you're wanting to fill your frame with something far away, you'll want to use a telephoto lens. It has a further reach and you can zoom into it. Another thing to notice when using a wide-angle lens versus a telephoto lens is the perspective it gives you. Take this photo of a football player, for example. Notice with the wide-angle lens, whatever is closer to the camera looks larger, and things further away from the camera seem smaller. It distorts the image and creates a greater sense of depth. Now look at this image taken with the telephoto lens of essentially the same thing. Notice how the image is compressed and there's no distortion of his body? Just something to keep in mind when deciding what lens to use. One of the things we battle as photographers is patience. Patience to sit and wait. Patience to get through this whole video. Sometimes we act like hurried tourists, and when we see a good image, we take the photo and move on to the next thing, but we lack the patience to sit and wait for it to become a great image. Here's a photo I took when I was first hired here at BYU. I saw this spiral staircase and wanted to take a nice photo of it. I saw these students walking down the stairs and I took the photo. Is it good? Yeah, but it isn't great. I wanted something a little bit more, so I sat and waited for someone to walk up the stairs. Now see the difference? Patience can help you turn a good photo into a great photo. Or sometimes we take a good photo once, but we don't have the patience to go back and make it a great photo later. Here's a photo that I liked that I took back in 2018 at a basketball game. However, there were different elements of it that I wished were different. I wish there weren't so many empty seats. I'm not a big fan of the composition, different things like that. When I took this photo the following season, it was missing some of the elements I liked in the first photo, like the flags being waved around, and this one lacked energy to me. Then I tried it again later that season. I liked this one a lot more, but there were still empty seats and it didn't capture the energy that was there. I felt like it was so close, but not quite there. Then came around the 2019-2020 basketball season and we played the number 2 team in the country, Gonzaga, at home for senior night. The Marriott Center was packed to the rafters and there was a ton of energy. This was the night I would get my shot. I knew where I was going to stand when the time came and I was ready. This photo was about 3 years in the making, and I'm so glad I was persistent and patient. Finally, I had all of the elements I was wanting: the flags, the packed arena, the energy. Not only do I feel this turned out to be a great image, it also ended up being a historic image with that huge win over the Zags. Along the lines of being patient, do not fear looking through your camera lens without taking any photos while you wait for just the right moments. If you see something that you want to happen or anticipate it can happen, just wait for it to happen. Time of day will make or break a great photo. If you can control it, a good time to take photos is often during golden hour, which is the first and last hour of sunlight during the day. Because the sunlight's traveling through more of the Earth's atmosphere, it diffuses the light and also gives it a warmer feel than the rest of the day. It might be a fun practice for you to take a photo of the same thing at different times during the day and see how different it looks depending on the time of day and where the light is. Now, I often feel sad for others when I wake up early in the morning to take photos somewhere like a national park, and then I see a line of cars entering the park as I'm leaving. They missed the park when it was most beautiful. Most people will never know how beautiful something can be if they never pay the price to see it at the right time of day. It's easy to take pictures during the day when everyone's awake, but sacrifice brings forth the blessings of heaven, even in photography. This is one of my favorite photos I have taken, not because it's the best photo I've taken, but because I woke up at around 3 a.m. to drive to this place. I about got stuck on a muddy road in a rental car with no cell phone service, and I was by myself just to get there for sunrise. And I will never forget how it completely took my breath away. Constructive feedback is critical in improvement. I know many of us are afraid of what others might say or think, especially those we look up to. But if we really want to take better photos, we need to be open and seek out feedback. And when that feedback comes, we cannot afford to take offense. If our objective is to truly progress and be a better photographer, wouldn't we want to welcome as much feedback as we can get? We have to overcome fear. One thing that is important to remember is feedback is often opinion. So you'll need to learn to sift through the feedback by truly thinking about it and processing it. Apply what you think will help the most, and then don't worry about the rest. If you really want to progress as a photographer, I greatly urge you to seek feedback from your peers and other photographers that you look up to. Now that we've gone through each of these 10 tips, did you notice I never mentioned anything about equipment? I want you to understand that you do not need amazing, expensive equipment to help you become a great photographer. It's about how you use the tool, not the tool itself. Now, it's true, good quality tools can help you in many ways, but learning the principles of photography will make all the difference. If I had to hire an inexperienced photographer with, let's say, like 30 grand worth of equipment, or a seasoned photographer with a cell phone camera, I would choose the guy with the cell phone camera every time. Just because you don't have nice equipment doesn't mean you can't be a great photographer. Hopefully there's been something helpful in these 10 tips that you can use to help you on your journey of becoming a great photographer. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at photo@byu.edu. We would be happy to help in any way that we can.